Hey everybody, Some Gadget Guy here, and here we go, folks. We finally have the Note 4 in-house for our real-world camera tests. Samsung is pairing their new ISO sensor, which was also found in the Galaxy S5, with true hardware optical image stabilization. A quick point before we get into the review, a number of early reviewers got it flat out wrong, that image stabilization was disabled during UHD video. The Note 4, like the iPhone 6 Plus, can use both hardware and software stabilization while shooting 1080p video, but software stabilization is too taxing to use while shooting UHD. Hardware stabilization, however, remains intact like it does on the LG G3. After you watch the samples here, you can compare them to our Galaxy Alpha review, which has a similar sensor but lacks hardware stabilization. Starting off with some flowers outdoors, we're seeing stunning detail for a phone. If you have a phone capable of shooting UHD and aren't taking advantage of it, you're really missing out on some tremendous detail and opportunities. Not the least of which is the fact that this phone is shooting 30 frames a second at a resolution of 8.3 megapixels per frame. Each frame of video here is a higher resolution than the best quality stills the iPhone 6 is capable of shooting. In trying to provide punchy, bright, pleasant video, I personally find that Samsung cameras tend to oversaturate the frame ever so slightly. This rose in shade, for example, while the pink is very pleasant, the sky is a somewhat unnatural shade of teal. White flowers in direct sunlight are starting to clip and lose detail in the brightest areas, but happily you can somewhat control the exposure while shooting video and manually force the scene a little bit darker. I can't tell you how excited I am to see this feature again, as many phones, even Nokia's, will refuse to allow users to control video exposure. As an extreme example, here's the same scene underexposed as low as the Note will go, and it provides us more detail in the petals here. For the most part, I'll be letting the camera decide on exposure throughout these tests to keep comparisons with other phone cameras fair, but I'll note exposure changes in the upper right corner of this video if I use any, as this is one of the handiest features you can have for improving the quality of your phone video. The focusing is smooth and accurate, though it doesn't quite feel as solid as what LG is doing with the G3. After locking focus, there's just a bit more tendency for the focus to occasionally hunt with your hand movements, but it's noticeably better than what HTC is currently using. It performs similarly to Apple's system in most of my tests, which is no small feat considering the slightly larger lens elements built into this phone. I'm still a bit frustrated by the lack of pre-focus for video. Samsung's app allows users to compose a shot and then decide in that moment whether they want to shoot a video or a photo. However, if you focus before shooting video, the frame is automatically reset when you push record. You just have to get into the habit of refocusing immediately after your video begins. Greens, purples, and blues are all punchy and satisfying. Yellows are still retaining detail, though I wish the Note had some options to control saturation. Reds showcase the same issues many smartphone cameras have. Slightly overexposing the brightness while punching up the color means we lose detail, and a predominantly red scene becomes something of a mess, a red blob of vaguely defined stuff. Again, dropping the exposure a stop improves the situation noticeably. The Galaxy S5 was a somewhat poor macro shooter. While the lens on the Note provides approximately the same minimum focusing distance, I feel the Note's app does a slightly better job of reporting back when something is actually in focus. Even the LG G3 fed me a frustrating number of positive locks, which turned out to be incorrectly focused when working near the minimum focusing distance. I've had far fewer false positives with the Note 4. The zoom on board is still fairly handy, even when shooting 4 times HD resolution. There's still some room to crop off of that 16 megapixel sensor. And while detail gets a bit soft and blurry at the farthest end of the zoom, I still think it's competitive with Apple's offerings at 1/4 the resolution, and Samsung seems to be avoiding the trap of piling on additional sharpening to try and enhance the scene. Into a walking test, the Note 4 is noticeably smoother than the Galaxy S5 or Alpha when shooting UHD. So we can see that hardware stabilization is being utilized. This brings Samsung shooters very close to the performance of Nokia hardware stabilized shots. The only phone I've seen handle our walking test better is the iPhone 6 Plus, which severely crops the middle of the frame to use both hardware and software stabilization at the same time. A trick the Note 4 is also capable of doing when shooting lower resolution resolution video, but personally I prefer having the wider frame and coping with ever so slightly shakier footage. Into a street scene, we see solid dynamic range. It's par for the course to see white cars start clipping in direct sunlight, but colors are really well maintained and the sky is a nice solid blue color. It's doing a fairly solid job of tracking movement as cars enter and exit the scene. We only see focus pulling or hunting when cars pass close to the camera. Otherwise, it's producing a very pleasant image here. And on our freeway test, where faster objects are moving through the frame, we again see solid autofocus performance with little hunting or confusion. The audio is also better than mid-pack here. The Note is happily producing stereo audio, unlike the mono audio on iPhone video. Samsung has been improving their noise reduction, and it no longer descends into that underwatery warbling destruction that you'll sometimes hear on LG phones. Though it doesn't quite reach the clarity of Nokia microphones. It is one of the better performers in the Android space. Of course, it has nothing to do with UHD video, but I do enjoy playing with slow motion video. The Note drops the resolution down to 720p, just like the iPhone, where it is also capable of hitting 240 frames per second. Unlike the iPhone though, the slow motion is better built into the actual video file, and I found it's easier to share and edit that footage. While the frame rate and resolution are comparable, I think the iPhone squeaks by with the victory in producing a slightly higher quality slow-mo, but the Note's slow motion is still fun to shoot and is easier to share. Into an exposure test moving from a dark scene to a bright scene and back, Samsung still delivers one of the best blooming exposure changes on any phone I've ever seen, and the frame rate stays pegged at 30 frames per second for smooth video. It's neck and neck with the performance of the iPhone 6, and Samsung is able to smoothly and cleanly transition while recording UHD. It's a pleasant effect, and I'm happy to see Samsung continue to excel here. And into some depth of field clips, the larger sensor here helps soften the backgrounds of your video more than what LG, Apple, or HTC can do with their smaller camera sensors. Background elements are far less distracting, and the camera can produce some really pretty looking bokeh balls when shooting light coming through tree leaves. Approaching macro distances, your backgrounds become delicious watercolor paintings with very little to distract the eye, but plenty of color to help fill the scene. An ugly fire hydrant, for example, becomes a tiny yellow dollop. Background trees and branches only suggest their shape. Like Nokia phones, the larger sensor really does make for more photographic pics and cinematic video. Into some nighttime video, I'll always be happy to see a phone maintain a higher frame rate. The Note 4 continues Samsung's tradition of not scaling back the frame rate for low light video. We stay pegged at 30 frames per second, and the camera will underexpose darker scenes to maintain that rate and keep noise somewhat in check. With our street scene, we do still see some internal lens flare and reflection from streetlights and headlights, but thankfully none of the ghosting issues we saw in the alpha, which might mean there could have been an issue with my alpha review unit. Even with some noise reduction blurring some of the details in the shot, we still have a crisp and detailed scene, with the camera doing a very good job of tracking fast-moving objects. Autofocus does take longer to latch on when less light is present, but once it settles in on a subject, we see the same consistency as we do during daytime shots, and the camera rarely gets confused or starts hunting around. Into our creepy tunnel scene, like the Galaxy S5 and the Alpha, the Note is doing a wonderful job of balancing the front face of the tunnel, washed in yellow light, and the bluish-white lights running down the tunnel. Of course, it wasn't freaky at all when the street light burned out while I was shooting this on the night after Halloween, because I'm super tough, so I wasn't scared, nor did I squeal or yell or run away like a tiny little child. And our creepy gate shows a similar trend in white balance to try and retain the color of the scene rather than searching for true scientific white. This gate is lit by really ugly yellow lights, and the Note is representing that here very well. One more example of solid white balance on our walkway shot, where these two lights drive me absolutely crazy in that one is more yellow than the other, and Samsung nails the exposure and color here too. Lastly, a flower lit by a porch light yards away, while the noise is cranking to pull off this shot and maintain the frame rate. Even pushing the camera to its low light limits, we can still see an incredible amount of detail. Though this was the slowest focus pull from the camera during all of our tests, with the autofocus really struggling to latch onto that subject. So where does that leave us with the Note 4? I have to admit to being spoiled by Nokia cameras over the last couple years. They were the first to really embrace image stabilization and larger sensors. While we've seen some good Android cameras over the years, none have really sparked that fun factor I've gotten from recent Lumias. The Note 4 is the first Android shooter I've used to really move into that league. While we can see a few quirks, the fact that this is only Samsung's third phone to use their own in-house developed sensor, it's pretty remarkable to see a hardware and software combo this refined. This is also the first phone camera I've felt hasn't asked us to sacrifice too many features while shooting Ultra HD video. Maybe the highest compliment I can pay the Note 4 is that I ended up with way more footage than I needed to produce this review, as I just really enjoyed shooting with it. I was really having fun using this camera, and it gave me some terrific results. And that's not something I felt as strongly from Android and Apple shooters in the past. This was my most anticipated Android camera review of the year, and Samsung did not disappoint. I would highly recommend checking out some of our previous camera reviews like the Alpha and the iPhone 6 so you can compare the Note 4's performance to other flagship devices. As always folks, thanks so much for watching and subscribing to this channel. I greatly appreciate all the conversation down in the comments, and I wouldn't be able to continue producing videos like this if you all weren't out there sharing these videos with your friends and on social media. Hit that thumbs up button, and I will catch you all on the next review.